Welcome to the panel about asymmetric security threats. How can states effectively manage the threats of terrorism? Is cyberspace becoming a new field of war? Does mass immigration pose a genuine threat to security? We encourage you to debate these matters.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be moderator for the debate on asymmetric threats to security. That's the real title of the debate. And let me introduce and invite to the stage our panelists, Dr. Iivi Anna Masso from Estonia. Iivi, she's advisor to the she served as advisor to the President of the Republic of Estonia. She's a political scientist, and she received a PhD from the University in Helsinki. Mr. Giles is the Director of Conflict Studies Research Center. He's a leading expert on security issues affecting Russia. Mr. Giles is also an Associate Fellow of the Royal Institute of International Affairs in the UK. And he is a regular contributor to research projects on Russian security issues in both the UK and Europe. Mr. Ilias Chantzos, he's a senior director of Symantec government affairs programs for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, as well as the Asia Pacific region. He's advising on public policy issues with particular regard to the IT security and data risk management and availability. Prior to joining Symantec, he worked as a legal and policy officer in the Directorate General Information Society of the European Commission, focusing on information security policy. Mr. David Görömbölyi from Budapest, he's a Hungarian diplomat, a foreign policy analyst and lecturer, expert on terrorism. He served here in Warsaw in the Hungarian embassy in our country until this year, and now he works as a counter-terrorism coordinator at the Hungarian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And Mr. Marcin Olender from Poland, he's head of European Affairs Unit in the Ministry of Administration and Digitization of Poland. He's many responsibilities, but one of them, very important one, is he's responsible for implementing cyberspace security policy of the Polish government. Welcome. Since this is a security forum, we're going to speak about threats to security and the nature of those threats. I read different definitions of asymmetric threats, and I'm not going to ask you to discuss how the most proper definition should look like, but let me mention just very simple one, which I found. Asymmetric threats or techniques are a version of not fighting fair, which can include the use of surprise in all its operational and strategic dimensions, and the use of weapons in ways unplanned by the enemy. So when we look at the current conflicts like Israeli-Palestinian, Islamic states, aerial Al-Qaeda activity, Russian aggression on Ukraine, when we look at the strategies and tools used by belligerents, we see that we are dealing with very unconventional situation. Present warfares are accompanied by misinformation, cyber attacks, identified armed person. Of course, asymmetric threats aren't anything new. Many times in the past, weak forces utilized surprise technology, innovative tactics, or violations of military etiquette to challenge the strong. But now we have, I think, huge escalation of using those unconventional methods, and those methods have more and more sophisticated forms. Let's start with the terrorism, the most classical form of asymmetric threats. And I would like to ask David, could you elaborate on the changes of the nature of terrorism and strategy of terrorism and the new form of terrorist activity?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Igor. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for this fantastic event. If I may, I'd like to thank specifically Executive Director Ms. Grzegorka, who is always hiding modestly, but she and the whole team have brought together a great lineup, great contents to this conference. So big respect for that, and I hope to be back next year too. So yeah, talking about the most classical form of asymmetric threats, terrorism, I think we have seen an obvious evolution of the phenomenon recently. Back in the good old times, the old school was the gun and the bomb. Now compared to that, we have a huge scale of tools and tactics. If I was a terrorist 20 years ago, I would just put a lot of dynamite in myself and blow myself up in the market. Now they do this, but also they start with the computer and hack certain systems. Then they go to the gas pipeline and blow a hole in that to disturb energy security. So there's basically a very wide scale of tools terrorists use. It became very interdisciplinary, if I may say so, and if its tools became kind of similar to those of hybrid warfare, like fourth generation warfare, or non-linear warfare, as some call it. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other is, with the emergence of today's most threatening, most dangerous terrorist organization, ISIL, we see some new qualities. We have seen these qualities in a lower importance, but there are two things which just hits in the face when we look at ISIL. One is its PR. You remember when Osama bin Laden used to record on a VHS cassette back in his cave a message, every once a year, and then they sent it by mail to Al Jazeera, and it was full of theological things. Even his own jihadists didn't quite understand. So that era has gone. ISIL uses a fascinating professionalism when it comes to their PR. They're using modern techniques, they're using online surfaces, Facebook, YouTube, whatever you like, and they have specialists to do that. Target audiences. When they want to spread fear, they know how to spread fear, and they make a professional video on that. When they want to recruit, when they want to seem even cute, then they do that, and they do it professionally, they do it high-tech, and that's how they can multiply their mission. If Osama bin Laden sent a preacher to Europe to recruit, maybe he could recruit 10. If they do it online, it multiplies, so they can recruit a lot. So coming from this new quality, the other new quality is the extreme percentage, proportion of foreign fighters on field there in ISIL territory. This is a great threat to our security, a threat the extent of which we don't quite understand yet, because they are still there. They haven't come back home yet. When they would come back home, they're gonna, because some of these are, of course, Western European or even American citizens, and most of them will have the right to come back home if they do it. If they do it cleverly, and they will have a lot of potential for radicalization, extremization, and or even committing actual terrorist crimes, terrorist acts back home. We believe that around 3,000, 4,000 Western citizens are actually fighting or have been fighting for ISIS, and altogether from all over the world, from other cultures, other Arab countries or wherever, we have more than 15,000. And if we consider the whole ISIL numbers, around 50,000 people, then this 15,000 is an enormous number. So that would be some new qualities. The day before I came here, I had a lecture for students, and one of these students said, "Okay, I'm watching the TV. So are we losing this battle? Are we losing the war against terrorism? Are we losing the war against the ISIL?" And my answer was an absolute no, because we might lose battles, and we are, and we will. But it's out of the question that we should lose the war. With the question of ISIL, I think it's unsustainable. When it loses its income, when it loses its recruitment sources, it will just go in a downward spiral. and then devour itself, meet its end there. Many people will die until that point, so we will lose battles, but it's out of the question that they might actually win the war. And on a more theoretical level, generally speaking about terrorism, we might lose battles because it's very easy to commit a terrorist crime, and it's very hard to track it. See, you spend $200 on a bomb with which you sink a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and you block oil trade for a couple of days, then you have spent $200, but you have caused billions of dollars of how you call it? Damage. Yeah, damage. Sorry, financial damage. Or beheadings, like the ISIL is sending back home its foreign fighters, telling them to commit terrorist crimes, to do beheadings. And beheadings are not done with drones or with high-tech equipment. They're done with kitchen knives. We can't track kitchen knives. Jamie Oliver uses kitchen knives. My grandma uses kitchen knives. We can't track people who are the citizens of Western countries. So it's very easy to do that, and it would cause a great social damage if it would happen, let's say, in the capital of one of our countries. So we will lose battles, but our general principles, our democratic standards, simply just not letting them to win the war, and finally, we of course shall overcome. I believe we will talk later about what steps are needed to do, so maybe that's that from now, and then thank you.
Thank you very much. Quite optimistic point of view that we lose just battles. Now, I would like us to discuss the very specific but important issue, the cyber security, cyber attacks becoming more and more popular weapon, and there's a really huge threat. So I would like to ask Ilias, who knows the issue very well, working for such a huge company. Probably you know much more than you can tell us, but tell us as much as you can. How cyber can be used in conflicts, and now, and how it can be used in the future. And before I let you start, I would like to remind all of you that in your devices you have the application when you can vote, and the question for this panel is: do you think that asymmetric security threats are more important today than more traditional threats? If you can vote, we'd be very happy. And please prepare for the second part of this panel to take active part in the debate. Ilias.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me this possibility to speak to all of you. On the question of have the asymmetric threats now become more important than, or at least as important as the traditional threats, I would answer unequivocally yes. And the reason why is because I work on cyber, and fundamentally cyber is seen as an asymmetric threat. In fact, to go a step further, I would like to tell you that I've been on cyber now for about 15 years. I started at around 2000. And I will tell you that at that time, information security was a nice to have. You couldn't fill up a room with people to talk to them about information security. And now, look at this, we have a big room, we've got plenty of people in the room. We even have young people in the room being interested in what we're going to be discussing. Usually back in 2000, if I would be talking about information security, people would imagine a guy with thick glasses living in the garage of his parents, drinking Coca-Cola, eating pizza only, having no life and no girlfriend. And that would be the information security geek, okay? Now it's a completely different ballgame. You look at where we are on cyber, and you will see that governments treat it as a tier 1 threat. In NATO, you have discussions about cyber being a major national security issue, being a topic that will keep busy the policymakers across the board. Prime ministers get involved in those discussions, which demonstrates how the game has fundamentally changed. Now, if I look at how do we define threat when it comes to cybersecurity, I would begin by saying that actually that definition is not an easy one. Because if you look at the way the cyber attacks happen, the motivation and the actors behind them can be very different. They can be, and primarily most of the activity that we see online is crime driven. So they can be financially motivated. Why do people attack the information society? Because that's where the money is right now. That's where is the value. The value is in the information. We can have politically motivated attacks. And the politically motivated attacks are usually driven either by some sort of anarchist vandalism, sort of like anonymous kind of protest against the political system approach. Or you can have politically motivated in the form of radicalization, and that is where is the terrorist angle. But I don't want to go into the terrorist angle right now because, quite frankly, from my perspective, the terrorist angle approaches cyber in a different way than what the sort of like traditional terrorists. And then you've got all the part that has to do with intelligence collection and escalation and conflict management, all the way to getting to the warfare state. Although, again, we can say that we have had a pure sort of like cyber warfare experience in Europe. Now, it's very important to bear in mind that these things mix with each other, okay? So blur with each other. In a way, you can very often, I like very often to draw a paradigm of the 17th century piracy in the high seas, whereby the pirates were commissioned by the king to attack certain types of ships, but then other ships of other nationalities that were just sort of like fair game. So you would attack a system because you're commissioned to do that by your government, by your intelligence service, or by a third party that eventually works for an intelligence service. You steal the data that you're supposed to do as part of your contract, but then you get additional information which you sell in the black market. There is a black market out there, by the way, for goods and information to be sold. So we see an evolution whereby you have state actors, you have organized crime groups, and you've got atypical actors, you've got mercenaries, if you like, that will go out and operate as a hired gun. Now, what are the future technological threats arising from all of this? Well, first of all, I think it's fair to say that if you look at statistics on cyber, we produce what is called the Internet Security Threat Report. It's probably the most comprehensive annual analysis of the kind of like cyber attacks that happen across the world. If you want a bedtime read, it's about 200 pages long, comes once every year. I think we're now on version 19, so we've been doing this for quite a while. Long story short, when it comes to, let's say, most targeted industries or most targeted sectors, you'll see government, you'll see that critical infrastructure providers, which is why I was laughing when I was watching the energy video. I came yesterday from the Middle East, and we were discussing exactly that question. How do you deal with targeted attacks on the energy infrastructure? And God knows that there have been plenty of those in the Middle East. So if you look at how is the threat landscape, the technical threat landscape evolving, clearly, first of all, we see a continuation and a mounting of targeted attacks which require significant skill. We see targeted attacks both on what we define critical infrastructure as well as into government systems. In terms of future technologies, mobility, cloud, Internet of Things are going to be the areas that will increase the attack footprint. Imagine, for example, the fact that we're expected to have smart metering by 2020 in every European house. So every consumer, be that a normal human being like yourselves and myself, or a jihadist radicalist, will have in his house a meter that will give him some sort of access to the energy grid. The kind of challenge that we're going to be facing will have to do with how do we manage the broadening of the attack surface on one hand and the massive amount of information which is generated from that on the other hand, both to protect them as well as from a privacy standpoint. The militarization of some of this technology is inevitable. Everything that can be used as a weapon will eventually be used as a weapon. And in that sense, attacking on sensors, communication systems, defense platforms, UAVs is probably the best example. The use of cyber for PSYOPs or for intelligence collection, some of these are examples that we have already seen. Some of them are in their infancy, but nevertheless, we're going to be seeing probably more and more. From a strategy standpoint, I think some of the biggest challenges is the escalation and conflict management bit. How do you use cyber as a conflict management tool, which is something that we see happening already. You look at all modern conflicts, pretty much after Estonia in 2007, they have a cyber component. So how do you use that? Is it a sort of like escalation? Is it a de-escalation tool? How do you manage the intelligence risk and the attribution around it? But also, how do you build deterrence around it is some of the key questions that come up. Obviously, the links around sort of like human rights, the usage of organized crime and terrorism, all those points are in there. The closing remark I would make is asymmetry, because this is the scope of this discussion. Asymmetry for me, when it comes to cyber, originates from two elements, risk and cost. Meaning, if I'm the defender, I have to be effective 100% in order to deal with cyber attacks. If I am the attacker, I have to be successful once to steal the information that I need. What does this practically mean? Practically, it means that as long as we adopt a passive, meaning defense only, not a proactive, not an intelligence-driven approach on cyber, the attacker will dictate all the rules of engagement. And what are these? That I don't know when, what, how, or where I'm going to be attacked. I just know I will be attacked. Okay? And the other aspect of that is the cost. So the cost of the asymmetry, a very good example is things that I'm sure you've all seen in the press, how with a small investment on cyber, and by the way, whatever people tell you, actually cybersecurity in comparison to traditional defense is actually cheap, much cheaper. Think of how much a cyber defense infrastructure costs versus an F-16, versus a fighter plane. So the key question for me, therefore, becomes a question of cost. How much do I need to invest in order to prevent a cyber attack, or to build a cyber attack capability, for that matter, if I'm the attacker, versus the kind of infrastructure I'm trying to compromise or to disable? The asymmetry is evident in the sense that the building of the attack tool from the attacker will always be much, much, much cheaper than the infrastructure that the attacker will try to disable.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the very interesting point. Mr. Giles, you spent a lot of time in Moscow. You know very well the situation, Russian military. I would like to ask you to elaborate on asymmetries in the Russian military.
Certainly, yes. Thanks, Igor. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. There was some discussion when we were working out how this panel would go a couple of days ago. We thought perhaps this might be the one panel at this forum where Russia didn't get a mention. But that comes to a crashing halt now, I'm afraid, because I'm picking up on two specific aspects of asymmetric approach by Russia that are particular problems at the moment. One of them fairly straightforward, one of them slightly debatable. The first one I'm going to choose is information warfare in the Russian sense of cyber, plus strategic communications, plus influence with a capital I, plus perception manipulation, and much else besides that for our countries tends to come in different silos of operations. I'll be introducing that briefly. Iivi, I think, will be majoring on it slightly later on in this panel. What we're seeing is the old Soviet tools of subversion and disinformation, which have been massively augmented by huge investment by Russia in language capabilities in order to reach target populations on a broad front, and the embrace of the internet. After a faltering start, now finally using social media to augment and multiply the effect of their investment in traditional media. What Russia has done is use first the experience of information warfare during the armed conflict in Georgia in 2008, and then a trial run during the election protests in Moscow and other cities in 2011 to perfect its means of influencing perception, so that, as General Korje said yesterday, at the present moment we are losing the information war against Russia. Russia has succeeded in creating for its own population an alternative reality, which is unrecognizable from ours, and is succeeding in providing that alternative reality as an option for Western audiences to join in with. And there is a spillover from this virtual reality on the other side, which is now penetrating remarkably deeply into Western thought processes. There are some overlaps with the propaganda techniques of ISIL that David was alluding to earlier, but in the Russian usage, this spreads across a much broader section of the population, so that you see Russian-backed narratives popping up in the most startling and dangerous places. And I'm not just talking about the famous Mearsheimer article and others of its ilk, but also plenty of other intelligent and educated people in academia, the media, policy circles even, most dangerously, who ought to know better but have drunk the Kremlin Kool-Aid, augmented by the online populations who are baffled and bemused by the efforts of the Kremlin troll army to divert or prevent or subvert debate so that the Russian narrative of what is happening in the world penetrates all across Western society. Now, Tim Dowes went into a little bit of detail on this yesterday. I hesitate always to disagree with Tim. I have the greatest respect for him, but I would like to qualify some of the comments that he made. He was suggesting that we are not in a new Cold War situation. I would agree with that, but he was saying this is because there is now open communication and contact between the two societies, between Russia and the outside world. I would submit that Russia has worked so very hard at preventing that contact and sealing its own information space, to use the Russian information warfare jargon, that we are now much closer to a Cold War situation than we were to the situation even just a couple of years ago when there was relatively free and open media access. I would also disagree that the obvious lies that are told by the Kremlin backfire and are counterproductive, because they only backfire if you are a Western audience. If you are watching Russian media, listening to Russian media, if you are not taking an active interest in seeking out alternative sources of information that disagree with the Kremlin line, then you have no way of telling that these are lies. And so I expect many people in this room will have had the experience of conversations with, again, intelligent, educated people in Moscow who are saying things which are so utterly bizarre that they are totally unrecognizable from reality in the outside world. This is happening now in exactly the same way as it did during the Cold War. Where I would agree absolutely with Tim Dowes is that what is required to deal with this is a strategic response and a coordinated response from Western societies and Western leadership in order to deal with the problems that this presents. The second topic that I'd like to introduce is one which is debatable because it doesn't satisfy the normal criteria for an asymmetric threat. I'd like to talk about the conventional Russian military. Ordinarily, you would not think of this as something asymmetric according to classic definitions, but at the present moment it is being used in ways and for purposes which have distinct characteristics of asymmetry, and so I would submit we need to include it in this category. After all, they've been extremely hard at work, extremely busy, the whole Russian military, since the beginning of this year, but still there is no actual full-scale, high-intensity conflict in Europe. So what is it that they're actually doing? I suggest that comparing Russia and the West, there are asymmetries of capabilities, of threat perception, and also of the will and intent to use armed force, all of which mean that we cannot at the present moment treat the Russian armed forces in the same way as we did a symmetrical conventional threat in the good old days. Ordinarily, you would consider an asymmetric threat to be from a weaker power. Well, Russia does still in some respects consider its military to be the weaker force. It's not so many years ago that the Russian military was a broken and incapable tool despite being very large. And it's the massive investment in transformation of the Russian military since 2008 that has changed that. It is still an ongoing process. Russia at the moment has parts of its military which it considers capable of doing the job, and it is those parts which are currently being used. And this is the reason why the troops and the capabilities that we see in the annexation of Crimea are extremely misleading if we are to consider the state of the Russian armed forces as a whole. Secondly, they're being used in different ways. The development of Russian thinking over the 20 years when they were incapable of fighting wars but thinking very hard about how to fight the next one has culminated in them interpreting what they see as Western-backed regime change around the world and then reflecting that back at us. It is a classic asymmetry. They wish to present facts on the ground without there ever needing to be an overt declaration of war, because full-scale conventional conflict is something which they will still shy away from at this point. And Russian thinking about threats also shows a distinct asymmetry, a mismatch and an imbalance between what we consider to be a military problem that requires a military solution and what the Russian general staff thinks would be the same thing. Now, yesterday morning we heard about the surprise, the unwarranted surprise at the Ukrainian consideration of signing an agreement with the EU being considered a direct threat in Moscow. But there's plenty more besides that we would not ordinarily consider to be a military problem, but if you read the Russian lists of, quote, threats to the military security of the Russian Federation are included. I'll give you just two examples. One, quote, efforts to ensure the energy security of Europe at the expense of Russian interests. I would suggest most of us don't think of that as a military problem, yet there it is on the military list. Second example, border disputes. Russia has some of them, but it is also listing as potential problems border disputes which, as far as we were concerned, were settled a long time ago. Kaliningrad, Karelia, both feature on the list of potential military threats to Russia, despite in the latter case everything having been settled in 1944. So, there are problems to which Russia is proposing military solutions which simply do not appear as such to us, so further surprises, I would suggest, are likely, including pretexts for the use of force by Russia, which I don't think we would necessarily expect. We heard in detail this morning about the trends in spending and defense capability in Europe and where they're going. Russia is still busy throwing money at its armed forces and improving its capability. If the two trends continue, if Russia improves and Europe deteriorates, at some point in the future they will obviously intersect, and Russia will be able to achieve its aim of a conventional overmatch of those armed forces in Western Europe. But they don't have to wait that long, because there are false multipliers working in their favor. One of them is the will and intent to use armed force, which they have demonstrated and which they have been encouraged in by the results of the armed conflict in Georgia, and now also they're receiving encouragement in the tendency to forget what has happened in Crimea and what is happening in Ukraine and allow Russia to get away with it. The second force multiplier is the information warfare aspect, which creates the preconditions and the environment for them to get away with it, both among their own populations and among the target audiences in Europe. That is where I came in, and that is where I'm going to hand over to Iivi to expand on that theme, and I think also on the uncomfortable nature of being a neighbor of Russia, which is even more exposed than Poland.
Thank you. Thank you very much. In fact, yes, here in this part of Europe we see some things much more clear than people in the other countries which are more in the West. Let's come back to the information warfare. Do you agree that we are really losing the information war with Russia, and how the propaganda wars looks like now and how they looked in the past?
Well, yeah, thank you, and good morning from me too. And yes, it's true that that in our region and in this time, in this situation, I think it's very hard to talk about any sort of threats, symmetric or asymmetric, traditional, not without dealing with Russia and talk about what they are doing. And well, choosing between asymmetric and traditional threats, it seems to me that now they are going hand in hand, while traditional threats are very much back the way that we didn't expect them to be. Cyber information, actually Russia is pretty modest with cyber in the Ukraine case as far as I know, but info war, like all the other elements of hybrid war, economic warfare, corruption, trade that intervenes with political decisions, and all that is part of the war that is waged directly against Ukraine, but indirectly against many other of us. Well, InfoWars was already mentioned. What's happening? Maybe going a bit more into detail. What exactly is going on? What exactly are they trying to do? And now I agree that terrorists are professional too, as it was mentioned. Russia, as a huge state with huge resources, is the major actor in this field, very obviously. And we see like different target groups. We see the domestic audience, which is well, for which an enemy is created. The bad West, which is threatening us, by which any actions against them are justified in advance often. Then it's the enemy or the opponent or the countries that are directly targeted, and there is a lot of intimidation going on. And it's not only speech acts. We see the airspace violations, and so we see like military action along with intimidating talk. And then there is the large global public. And we see huge investments. Russia Today, RT, has some $300 million budget, I'm hearing, and it's going to be increased by 40% to include German and Spanish languages. And well, why such big efforts? It can be, like it was mentioned here, it can be like kind of preventive justification for actions that are about to be taken, or creating images of countries we Estonians know very well, and other Balts as well. The story about little nasty Nazi states, and now it's the Ukrainians who are the main fascists. We can also, it's interesting to see how the meaning of a specific speech act, it can be the same sentence, the same meaning, in a different context is different. Because when 3 years ago, a Russian official might say publicly about Estonia that, you know, you are fascists, and well, they're fascists over there, and they're discriminating the Russian minority, then it sounded just like, you know, some sort of bitterness after losing an empire. Now when they say the same thing, it sounds like a threat, especially when they put Ukraine in the same sentence, you know, because, you know, like Ukrainians, you are fascists, you are treating our co-ethnics badly, so, and then you can like read implications in there. What here is a major asymmetry when we're talking about asymmetric threats, or asymmetric, like, if not military, then hostile actions. Here we should mention that it's a certain moral asymmetry. Keir already mentioned that there is a difference in willingness to apply military force. There is also a moral asymmetry when it comes to information, the willingness to lie, like to use plain lies, and like not to check facts, not to allow free press, for example. So when the West has its own criteria, its own standards, so the propagandists plainly use it and abuse it against us. We have the free speech, and they use the free speech in the West for the propaganda against those same Western values. And if you're not willing, well, the response is very hard here, because it's you have only bad options. Actually, you have, if you try to use the same means, if you try to ban their channels, if you try to, well, push it as hard yourself, then you become like them. So then you do actually what they want. You give up your own values, and when you don't, then they just go on with their propaganda. So in this sense, you have, like, you know, if we share a cake, and the default position is that I think it's fair that I get half of it, and you say that you want all of it. And then when we go for an objective middle way, then we end up giving 3/4 to you and 1/4 to us. And I think this is very much what is happening when the Western media tries to be objective and neutral between views that are obvious, like blatant lies and propaganda, and then like genuinely neutral information, even if all of us have particular perspectives. And then maybe something that it was also mentioned that the Russian side of the story has penetrated Western institutions very far. And well, here I must quote my boss, the president of Estonia, has recently talked about the frog boiling tactics, which means that those who know biology, it's if you try to boil a frog, if you throw it into boiling water, it'll jump right back. So it won't work. But if you gradually turn the temperature up, then it just adjusts to the new temperature, and it won't be able to, it won't notice when it gets too hot, and then it gets boiled. And that's kind of happening with the West when like step by step it's becoming tougher, it's becoming harder, and we accept more and more. Like a very good example is Ukraine. Well, it was 10 years ago, even Russia said that they have no problems with Ukraine joining the European Union, and now they tried to sign association agreement, which is much less, and it's brought up as a reason to attack them, and even some in the West accept it as a reason to attack them, and they accept the language of Western expansionism as if it's the West's fault, that is. So it's like this trying to be objective and listening to their side of the story and giving like bit by bit, that may end up that we actually get somehow caught in the web of lies. Maybe we can go on later.
Yeah. Keir mentioned that he meets people, intelligent and educated people in Moscow speaking incredible things, but we can very often also meet them not only in Moscow but in many Western, especially Western European capitals. Marcin Olender, he's a representative of Polish government. You are responsible for implementing the cybersecurity policy. What, from Warsaw point of view, is the most challenging problem? How do you see those asymmetric threats from point of view of Warsaw?
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Well, that's a very difficult question, because picking one as the most important is pretty difficult. You can pick few. Yes, especially what Ilias said, that asymmetry is an inherent trait of cyber threats. They will always be asymmetrical. So I think this is, and from this point, departing from this point, we just have unlimited number of different problems that this gives rise to. So the whole thing is just one major problem, because we, as especially policymakers, and then we define as a ministry, we define the policy, but there are various government agencies that then have to react or carry out these policies. So from a government standpoint, this is just lack of known or already established methods of dealing with these new kinds of threats, of the whole notion of conflict or war. We know what a conventional war is. We can define that, we can see it. But when do we define, Ilias I think said that we haven't had a warfare experience in Europe yet. But have we? Maybe we have. I think Estonians might be reluctant to admit this viewpoint. And when will we know when there is a war? Is there a way we can actually pinpoint this situation when when the amount of unfriendly actions taken in cyberspace will amount to war. The Talon Manual was a sort of the first attempt of us of transporting the international legal concepts we have already established onto the cybersphere. But I don't think we've gone, and I think there's a second edition planned, because we haven't answered these questions, and I don't really see them being answered anytime soon. This is all a gray area. We know there's enemy combatants in our virtual space virtually all the time. There's a conflict of some degree happening all the time. We have the question of where is this? We don't know where this is coming from. We don't know who these combatants are. We don't know what they want. They are invisible for most of the time. We can sometimes only see their traces. What if a conflict arises? If it does, and when it does, it will probably be, again, employ so many different actors, which have been mentioned, the virtual pirates, the people who we can actually pinpoint as acting on behalf of some state, but there are people who are perhaps we might suspect, but we're not sure, and a lot of innocent or not consciously acting in concert with that state, but being, for example, manipulated, thinking they are doing the right thing. Activists, for example, they can be our own people acting against us in this scenario. It's a huge, huge mess, and dealing with that kind of situation demands. I was hoping for some answers, but I see we just have a lot more questions. We have to decide basically what is the red line, and because if we do decide, I don't think we're quite sure what will we do when someone crosses that line. Are we ready to, for example, retaliate by physical force to a cyber attack? Or should we just retaliate with a cyber attack? Or should we just sever perhaps internet connections with the country we suspect to be? But this is difficult. Like I said, they can be employing botnets that are just distributed all around the world. Are we going to disconnect ourselves from everything? This is just such a massive amount of things we have to consider. We are working with the Polish Bureau of National Security on their document, which is called the Cyber Doctrine, which touches upon these questions, and we actually we tried our best to define the notions of cyber conflict and cyber war, but they're just not. I don't think we're there yet. So there's a lot of things to consider, and we have another consider as policymakers. If you're just considering the security angle, of course you're trying to make systems or your country secure. Because we're talking about the exchange of information, we touched upon this again between us and Russia, for example. We're free, open societies, and open internet is a great value that we try to promote and maintain in different international fora. So while acting to keep us safe, we cannot actually compromise the basic values that our societies are built upon. So this is another level of complexity that we must face, because what use is being secure if you're not, you make your own jail cell just to be secure. That's not what we're going for. So some sort of equilibrium or compromise there needs to be struck. So this is a very difficult question. So I think this is basically. I don't want to overuse my time, but. These are, I think, the questions we are facing. We had a really large-scale, almost 300 participants exercise, a pan-European exercise, Cyber Europe, at the end of October. We participated in that, and the scenario was exactly such that there's a number of, we don't know, this is the asymmetry, we don't know what's happening. There are various goings on coming from different directions of completely different nature, and we don't know if they're connected, if there's an aim, if there's a purpose, who's acting, why, what do they want. And another piece of the puzzle is in Europe especially, that perhaps our cooperation mechanisms are not yet at the state they probably should be. Because if there's one attacker, he has all the plan, he knows, but we don't. He may be attacking different parts of Europe, and if they're not talking to each other, if they're not cooperating, we will not be able to mount a sufficiently fast and robust defense. So this is another level of complication that we must face. So I'm sorry if this sounds really negative, but there's a lot of questions and a lot of work to do. We're working on a directive which perhaps will offer some answers maybe, but there's a lot of work to be done.
Definitely, there's lots of work to be done, and thank you for the description of the different threats and the general situation. The situation is very difficult. The enemy is invisible. We don't know many things. We don't know this, and that. But I think also we very often don't want to admit that we in the West, we don't want to admit that we have a real tough problem, and we can, and we don't want to act. So my general open questions to everybody, to all panelists, but also to the public, is how the Western world can defend itself. What shall we do? What kind of tools can we use, and what kind of tools we can't use because of our values, because of our democratic systems? How can we counter all those attacks? David Iilis.
Thank you. Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, of course, and it always will be. It was fascinating for me to hear experts from other sides of asymmetric threats, other aspects, and hearing very similar concerns with my area. Coming to the question, what to do? Returning to my main field, terrorism, and its most important manifestation nowadays with ISIS. The first and foremost important thing is to fight them and stop them from killing people. It's going on right now. We have all heard about the three-stage Obama plan strategy. So I don't want to elaborate on that. That would just spend a lot of time. But it's going on the field. There are more than 60 countries worldwide who are helping this coalition, even countries which are not directly affected. Our countries even, like I'm not sure about Poland, but my country has done a lot of humanitarian work and offers, and we have supplied the Kurdish troops with millions of rounds of ammunition. So even countries which are not directly affected are taking part in this coalition, and it's very, very important because terrorism knows no boundaries. And sometimes, interestingly, but logically, terror attacks might happen where we don't expect them. Ask the people of London, ask the people of Madrid. They were not expecting it there. So we have to fight them and stop them. On another level and parallel to this activity, we need to prevent the jihadists, the radical fighters, the foreign fighters. We should prevent them from getting there, or if they're there, we should prevent them from coming back. Now that's really the needle in the, how's the expression? In the haystack. That's an extremely difficult task. Our services are monitoring non-stop transit routes. Our services are exchanging information with foreign counterparts. The international cooperation on this aspect has been booming in the last couple of months. The Hungarian Secret Service just stopped a Dutch lady who wanted to join the fight, and it was on the information gathered the previous day by the Dutch Secret Service because she wrote in an email that she will go and start killing Christians. But that was one, and we might catch the next one, we might catch the next one, but when they're coming home and when they're avoiding the most logical transit lines, some might sneak through. A student of mine was asking me, so why can't we just catch them all? And I told her the story of Margaret Thatcher. You must know this story when the IRA planted a bomb at the Conservative Party Congress venue, and they blew it up. Margaret Thatcher was unharmed, but there were casualties. Next day, Margaret Thatcher gave a speech, which actually raised her acceptance index. But on the same day, the leader of IRA also gave a speech, which became legendary. He said, Maggie, you have to be lucky all the time. We have to be lucky once. And here I come back to what Ilias has said. In cyber, the attackers have to be lucky only once. In terrorism, the attackers have to be lucky only once. So that's why it's an extremely difficult job. But we have to use all the resources that we have, because simply it's just crucial. And at the same time, and I'm coming back to what you said, we have to respect all the human rights, which in Western civilization we have built in these last thousands of years. And I was at a conference in Minsk 2 weeks ago where a lady said that when it comes to security versus human rights, security has to prevail. Well, I would argue with that, because that's exactly what we're trying to protect: our values, our lifestyle, the Western way of living. Thank you.
Ilias and Iivi.
Thank you. Lots of points been raised, many very good points from Marcin. Do we have a war on cyber? I hesitate to say yes. I don't think we do, because as far as I'm concerned, being a lawyer, I will look the definition of war, and I don't see warring states. At the same time, do we have massive efforts of intelligence collection from different actors around the world? Yes, of course. But you know, if you think about the 60s and the 70s, when a massive amount of spy satellites was launched, and everybody was flying over and taking pictures of each other's territory and doing intelligence, we didn't say that that was amounting to war. In fact, collection of intelligence by some opponents was something that prevented the Cold War from becoming a warm war. Which again points back to the fundamental problems when it comes to cyber and the questions of, again, in the form of asymmetry, deterrence as well as attribution. How do you do deterrence on cyber? I mean, the historical example of, let's say, physical conflict is, look, I've got 1,000 tanks and you've got only 200, therefore I am deterring you. On cyber, what are you going to say? I got many computers, come see my lab. I got a lot of geeks, lots of people who have PhD in computer science. Another problem around cyber and deterrence is the question of demonstrable effect. Example, we all know what a nuclear bomb does, right? I mean, we've seen it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What does a cyber weapon do? I mean, do we know even if it's going to work? Because you know what? My security may be so good that I will block it. No. I got the super weapon and it's going to work. Really? How? I can't tell you. Because it's secret. It's clandestine. The whole idea behind it is I use it or I lose it. But if I don't use it, then I've lost it also. So I guess I'm saying all of these examples just to demonstrate the fact that, I mean, on the other hand, by the way, if we stick to that logic, I use it, I lose it, but if I don't use it, I lost it anyhow, that means I have an offensive preference, actually. I end up wanting to go and do a first strike first. In which case, again, we end up into a discussion of what's a second strike, the discussion about cyber being sort of like so distributed that there's always a second strike capability, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly the discussion sounds like nuclear war doctrine, and actually it's not, for the reasons I just explained. So I guess I'm saying all of this to demonstrate that when it comes to things like doctrine, attribution, questions like collateral damage linked to the fact that, you know what, if it's a botnet, it could be my mother's PC, which is usually used to do Skype with me, that is also launching a cyber attack in Estonia. So in the end, it becomes a question of how do we try to build a security doctrine and an understanding of our risk posture in an environment that frankly isn't trusted, and we try to build trust. So looking into how do we determine the red line, my first reaction would be, that, well, determining the red line needs to be us having a basic understanding as to whether a threat will eventually amount to the equivalent of a physical attack, or the way we would understand a physical attack that would be justifying an immediate, decisive, and equivalent retaliatory response. What does that mean? Is that even possible in cyber? Well, you know what? If the targeted country is North Korea, well, probably it's not. There are not that many computers. Okay, so if you have a security incident with North Korea and you're thinking that the appropriate response is cyber, chances are that that's not going to be effective at all. So again, when one is looking at what's the red line and how do we react when the red line is crossed, then the discussion needs to be much more around what are the appropriate instruments of power that you as a state have and is able to use, be that political, economic, and perhaps as a last resort, military, as opposed to, oh, they've cybered me, so I'm going to send my sort of like super spikes, my electronic harpoon, and mess up their hospitals and their water processing facilities. So, again, you know, we need to be very, very cognitive of that. So when I'm looking at what are the answers that we need to be trying to build in this sort of environment, I'm thinking of three things. And some of them are inside actually the NIST directive, the Network and Information Security Directive that Marcin mentioned. So we need to be building obviously our defensive capabilities, and I'm stressing the word defensive here. So we need to put in place the mechanisms that allow us to be effective in countering the cyber threat. And that may mean things like the best practices that this directive has in place. Have a CERT. Know what your critical infrastructure is. Have an authority responsible to manage that. Obviously, we need to build the doctrine, and otherwise it's also a question of cooperation, both among states, but even more so within your own private sector, within your own critical infrastructure operators. Security versus privacy, we don't want to destroy our way of life, clearly not, but a key requirement for me to keep my wallet private is me not to leave it here on the table and walk away. Which means what? A key component for me maintaining my privacy is my ability to deny access to my information. So security versus privacy, laws of nature, I'm afraid. Security has to go first. It's like gravity. You can't disprove it.
Thank you. Before I pass mic to Eve, I would like to ask the public, how many of you would like to take part in the discussion? 1, 2, 3, 4 voices. Okay, so please, if you could just 1 minute statements, and then we, Eve, please.
Well,
and then we'll ask the public.
Maybe just one little addition in that cyber line would be I just talked to some policemen in Estonia who are dealing with cyber crime, and they're really worried that some countries in the EU want to implement data protection laws that will basically eliminate, force service providers to eliminate all traces of yes, and that would make it virtually impossible to gather any evidence for them. So it's crucial that legislators be computer literate and take cyber into account when making laws. But still, coming back to the information side, what to do to resist the info war? I think it's crucial to be brutally honest. I mean, not to fight lies with other lies, but to be brutally honest, to go on with telling the truth and really call spade a spade, so to say. There is a joke I've heard recently that if it's a duck, if it walks like a duck, if it acts like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, and it denies it's a duck, then it's Putin's duck. So don't give in to the denial, say things as they are, and this is very much a message to media people, to editors and journalists, don't go along with the euphemisms that very often come from the propaganda machines, talking about crisis instead of aggression and so on and so forth. And which is also important, not to give in to intimidation. I mean, not to not to be afraid when they want you to be afraid.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, as Iivi mentioned, it is extremely difficult to counter this remarkable Russian facility of being able to say with a straight face something that they know perfectly well, that you know perfectly well is perfectly untrue. But there are one or two ways of doing it, especially important because it is such a central plank of the Russian strategy. Now, back in May this year at the Moscow Security Conference, the Secretary General of the CSTO, Nikolai Bardyuzha, said, in information warfare, the side that tells the truth loses. They've already decided that we are going to lose. What can we do about it? Well, it is extremely hard to attempt to guide our media without sailing perilously close to compromising those values we're talking about. However, our media can at least be assisted. And in that context, you have to bear in mind that Western liberal journalistic training, and I speak from my own experience at BBC and print media as well, is no match for a targeted information campaign where everybody from the President of the Republic down to the lowliest Kremlin troll is saying exactly the same thing because of the confusion between balance and objectivity. They seek balance, therefore objectivity goes out the window because Russians are saying this, therefore we have to report it. However, there are two things that can be done specifically. First, tell the truth, but tell the truth in an easily accessible way for the media, the liberal media, which has a total freedom of expression, to choose and to have available to it what is actually the facts, to compare with the list of Kremlin lies about, for example, who shot down MH17. They provide 15 different implausible versions. The truth is lost among them. Second thing that can be done, and it's remarkable that it isn't being done yet, in those European countries that do have legislation which is intended to ensure that media outlets do at least tell something which is vaguely resembling the truth, use it. Use the legislation against outlets like RT, like all of the other Russian media empires that are now spawning and spreading their tentacles into the West, because that's what it's for. There is a defense against this.
Marcin?
Yep. I largely concur with what Ilias said, but I'd like to pick up perhaps on the wallet comparison and something what Keir said, that let us not just think big in terms of certs and perhaps like big security agencies. I mean, you work for Symantec. Security starts with the average user, the average person. I think this is where we need to really put our efforts into education. You said media, but education through media, through schools, you know, just put the message out there that, you know, when you're not securing your computer, you're potentially, you know, adding a bot to the enemy's botnet. So it's a sort of civic duty for you to care about your security of your hardware, of your system. So I think this is something we really need to work on, especially in Poland. And there is perhaps, no, I will not say that. That's too adventurous. I will stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Gentlemen, could you pass the mic? And if you could introduce yourself.
Tadeusz Krzywda, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Thank you very much. It was an excellent discussion about new activity in the cyber, but I don't like the term asymmetric threat and asymmetric warfare concerning the cyber. From my point of view, when we're looking into history of the wars of the human being, always we find smart people looking for a weapon using against other, which was also some kind of asymmetric attack at the time. We had land activity. Later we had, as you said, about pirates in maritime domains. So we have a few, already 4 domains when human activity is fighting. Cyber, as people move to the cyber with their activity, is a new domain when we have our day-by-day activity, and also we can provide war in this domain, like we did in the air, maritime, and land in the past. So it is not asymmetric. The problem for me is when the spying, intelligence, or crime, like you said, is changing from this activity for the war between states. And I think, do you think this is time to change or to start working on the international law of the war in the new domain, like we have law on the maritime, air, and or you should change also the Geneva Convention, adopt to this new domain, which is now human activity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the discussion. We've mentioned the so-called pro-Kremlin troll army, as well as ISIS propaganda succeeding in the information war, but we didn't mention the Chinese. And my question is, what do we know about the Chinese activity? Because there were many reports suggesting that Beijing might be controlling the strongest cyber power at the moment. So are there any reports about that? Are there any reports about the activity, or are there any informations about Chinese being the danger for the cyber security? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Aaron Plutz. I'm working in the Office of Defense Cooperation in Kyiv, Ukraine. We've talked a lot about cyber warfare and the topic of asymmetric warfare. Dr. Masso also brought up the Crimea invasion in regard to asymmetric warfare. And my question is in regard to when Article 5 should be implemented. Mr. Olender mentioned that it's extremely hard in the cyber warfare realm to know when an attack, we can definitively say we have been attacked. But my question is in regard to the favorite Putin tactic of the polite men, or the little green men, in the context of looking at the new NATO security strategy being debated on if we should revise it or not. How can we definitively know in regard to this type of attack, when we could say a trigger has been met, and we definitively know that, say, in the Baltic states, we see a Russian minority population being agitated or whatever, if it's outside, if it's from outside, or if it's a natural event occurring from within. What trigger can we definitively put in our new strategic plan? Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? There was one hand. Ah, here's Jim, in the second row.
Thank you. I'm the Ambassador of Spain. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. This is more than a question, some reflection on the past in some areas, because, for example, it has been mentioned here that a new tactic can be used by terrorist organizations is blowing up oil pipelines. Well, the FARC has been doing that in Colombia for the last 40 years. In other respects, for example, cybersecurity is now a trendy issue, okay? But there are many other things that have been trendy in the past. I remember when I was at college, the big story was whether the Libyans would be able to bring a small attaché case to New York with a nuclear bomb, dirty nuclear bomb, by the way. So, I mean, priorities change, and the reasons why people are afraid change. And the thing is, life is full of dangers, and we are always going to live at risk. That's I mean, if you're alive, you are at risk. And some things you have to take into account first when you're dealing with a state, not a projected future state like the Islamic State they want to create now, where you don't know what you have to strike really if you want to counter threat their threats. But I mean, for example, there are 1,200,000 people are killed every year in automobile accidents, and nobody has thought of prohibiting road traffic. I mean, because it's essential. You cannot maintain the economic system, the capitalist economic system, the modern economic system without it. So when we talk about possible intentions from other powers, superpowers, countries aspiring to be superpowers again. We have to take that into account. Cyber warfare is very nice, but very nice. It could be very effective and destructive, but so would be chemical warfare, and nobody's going to attempt it because they know what the consequences are. And atomic warfare was tried once in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was never tried again. The consequences were horrible, too horrible to be contemplated. And our public opinions will not tolerate a certain behavior by our governments. And it's individual freedom versus security. Well, we live in democracies where individual freedom is always the main priority. If you make security the first priority, then you live in a state of war, which may be necessary in a democracy. I mean, when, I don't know, in the US or the UK, during the Second World War, measures were taken against freedom of expression, for example, but it's a temporary measure. So what I wanted to say is that everything is a little bit, to some extent, relative, and I don't want to say nothing is new under the sun, but things are the way they are, and big powers tend to expand, and big continental powers tend to expand, and big continental powers that don't have maritime frontiers but land borders, they expand at the expense of the neighbors. We have to take measures so that they don't expand at our expense, but that's that's basically it. There are new threats, there are asymmetric threats, terrorism. I'm from Spain. 900 people, close to 900 people were killed by ETA. At the same time, we had 5,000–6,000 people killed in automobile accidents every year. Of course, what was politically important and relevant was the people murdered by ETA, not the people killed in automobile accidents. But in the end, the state took action, and now traffic laws are enforced, and we have 1,000 people killed instead of 5,000–6,000 people killed every year. So there's always things you can do. And the most important thing is the political consequences of the actions of others. And we live in democracies. Our governments want to stay in power, protecting ourselves, and that's basically it. This important asymmetric threats are important, but I mean, I remember when I was a child, there was a good movie where somebody was planting a virus in, I don't know, in a dam close to San Francisco, killing potentially millions of people. Nobody has ever tried that. Of course, it can be tried, but if you want to defend or to preempt any possibility, you're going to have to kill lots of people, and it's probably not worth it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting voice, but doesn't mean that we should not do anything. We have 5 minutes, let's say, a few minutes more. If you can give short comment or answer a few questions, please.
Yeah, certainly. Very, very briefly, yes. I think I can see the academic merits of having a debate on whether cyber warfare is actually an asymmetric tactic, but I'm pretty sure that for the time being, until the normalization of cyber as a domain of conflict, this is a very convenient bracket to put it under. On the other hand, adapting international law for cyber warfare is an extremely dangerous topic, mostly because of the intense efforts by Russia and China and by those other countries that think like Russia and China, of which there are many more in the world than we tend to think when looking at it from Europe, to put in some new form of treaty, convention, other international legal instrument governing cyber warfare. This is intensely undesirable from the point of view of our perspective of internet freedoms and how the international rule of law works. So it's a dangerous topic to broach in the first place. On cyber in China, I'm going to defer to Ilias. It's very much going to be his patch. Captain Pluto's question about Article 5 and when does it kick in? Well, that's a question which has been exercising us and the Russians for a very long time, which is why they are working so hard on calibrating interventions sub-Article 5. But it remains extremely important to leave that ambiguity in Article 5 and not say what we are not going to do, because we've heard at length this morning that places all the cards in the Kremlin's hands. So leaving it open and ambiguous is extremely essential. But just one point on that, on specifically the cyber issues, you might wish to know that according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, NATO had classified cyber attacks as something which merits an Article 5 response even before it was discussed in Newport. This is very different from NATO's actual position, and it's just another example of the mismatch in perception of what is happening between the two sides, which is actually extremely dangerous.
Thank you. Yes.
So, about asymmetry and cyber. The way I have defined asymmetry was around the cost and around the risk. If what you're saying is that cyber can be used as a weapon in a conflict, therefore we're talking about, let's say, 5 domains instead of the historical 4, therefore we should not treat it as asymmetric, I don't necessarily disagree with you. I said from the beginning, as far as I'm concerned, if it can be weaponized, it will, and I even mentioned the likely targets. The question is, if we look at it from the point of view of asymmetry, what are the asymmetries in cyber and how they can be used, which is why I qualified it in this panel. I don't think there is a different view on substance. In terms of laws of war on cyber, I would tend to agree with the previous speaker that this is a position that, first and foremost, countries like Russia and China are pushing the idea of a strategic arms limitation treaty on cyber. I would say that the discussion, less so for laws of war and much more for norms around what is the appropriate rules of behavior on cyber among states, is something that, let's say, the London process has started, followed by Budapest, and afterwards in Korea, in Seoul. I understand. Actually, next week, I'm participating in a discussion in the Netherlands on that particular topic, so I hope that we're going to be seeing more and more progress. So what about the Chinese? I would invite you to look at, so first of all, I am not in a position to comment whether the Chinese government is active in this area and the kind of activities it does, because we're not in a position to do a direct attribution to a country, to a state. Usually this kind of attribution is linked with other national intelligence which we would not be in possession of. Usually we tend to see the technical aspects of the cyber attacks. Having said that, I would invite you to look into research papers that Symantec has released, such as, for example, the Hidden Links research paper, which is fairly recent and talks about a Chinese-based team of hackers which is specializing both on crime, which is fulfilling really the definition of piracy that I gave, specialized on crime on one hand, and also specialized on government types of attacks. When do we know that the trigger has been hit or has been reached? As I said before, it's a question of attribution both of technical intelligence as well as of other forms of intelligence that the governments would be able to reach in order for them to do the attribution. As regards final remark, the comments of the esteemed ambassador of Spain, I would tell you that on balance, we can debate what should be the sort of like the focus of every public policy. Nevertheless, judging from the recent Spanish national cybersecurity strategy, the NATO summit, as well as the EU priorities, it seems that the consensus is that cyber is fairly up and trendy, luckily for me at least.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. Just 1 minute. Excellency, you have mentioned that atomic and chemical weapons are not being used partly because our public opinion would not accept that. Well, there are parts of the world where public opinion doesn't matter at all. So we cannot be assured that in the future they will not be used if someone gets access to them. So we always have to address these issues. Yeah. For example, Syria. No one cared about public opinion there. Of course, people have tried poisoning water storage systems, but they were intercepted by countermeasures. So that's why we have to always be there on the walls, protecting. Or if someone decided not to try, they did not try because they knew they were going to be intercepted. So the protection, the awareness always has to be there. And I believe we cannot compare car accidents exactly because there is no killing intention there. And there is a violent killing intention about the deaths caused by terrorism, by ETA. Those 600 deaths were actually deliberate deaths, on-purpose deaths. Someone wanted those deaths. And there we have a surface to act, primarily through education, primarily through prevention of radicalization. Thank you.
Thank you. Marcin?
2 quick points. On the triggering of Article 5, I think the easy part is what extent of attack or what consequences of an attack. I mean, if someone dies and such an attack is completely possible disruption of some sort of control system, I mean, that would already probably trigger. The problem is attribution, like Ilias said. Who actually is responsible? Are we willing to gamble that our intelligence is solid enough to implicate a particular assailant? And that would be the problem. And as far as the comments of Your Excellency, I definitely agree that sometimes there is a tendency to overplay some you know, sexy issues like cybercrime, and perhaps some of this we are seeing, but there's always in public policy that there needs to be a cost-benefit analysis. As Ilias said, right now we are spending a fraction of public money on countering cyber threats, and I don't think this. I think this. We're not overreacting yet.
And the final word goes to Tallinn.
Well, and in Tallinn there is actually the NATO Cyber Center of Excellence, so they are working on those questions. And as far as I know, as to Article 5, actually, there is some sort of agreement now that it's not the same in kind, but the same in scope as the response has to be. So if actually by a cyber attack people get killed, then it is possible that the response will be something other than cyber, if the perpetrator is known, which is hard often in cyber case. But then still about InfoWars, it was mentioned, I'd like to come back to what was said about lies backfiring before. You said that in the West they might, in Russia they don't, and I would take it even further. I'm afraid that they don't even in West, that it's one of the purposes to actually cause confusion. We lie because we can. And I'd like to finish by quoting Andrei Illarionov, a former Putin aide who visited Tallinn and who said, and I very much agree with him on this, that, it was mentioned that open communication and contact might be a solution, and I finish with Illarionov's pessimism. He said that one of the big mistakes we made in 1989-91 was that we believed that if we don't have the Iron Curtain, if we will have a free flow of information and free access to facts and information, then brainwashing people massively will be impossible. And now in 25 years we have learned that unfortunately it isn't impossible.
So that's the pessimistic end of this discussion, but we are losing battles, but we have to finally win the war. I wish you that we will win on all the fields. If Anna Masso, Keir, Giles, Ilias, Chantzos, David Görömbölyi, Marcin, Olender, Igor, Janke. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.